So many times Bob would come up to us on Back to the Future 2, and he'd come over and he'd say, you know, fellas, here's what I'm thinking. Here's the shot. You know, Marty comes over and he jumps on the hoverboard and he makes a right turn and he goes over there, and it's all going to be in one shot. Can we do that? Can we do that? And you go, yeah, sure, Bob, we can do that. Sure, no problem. And he'd walk away and we'd all look at each other and go, we can do this. But we, you know, you figure it out. You know, you get challenged and you figure out how to do those things. And it's great. It's great to be in that environment where you get the opportunity to create something that's never been done before. And I think Zemeckis is one of those directors that pushed all of us past the limits of what we were capable of really doing at the time. It's terrifying, but very gratifying when you actually do figure out how to do that. You got to remember, you know, if there were 50 visual effects shots in a film, that was an enormous visual effects movie. Even in Backdraft, we might have had 5 visual effects shots in the whole film. Spider-Man was a real turning period in visual effects work, I think, in movies, because it was the first time they could really do a CG character. So they could do a CG takeover of Spider-Man. You know, you see Tobey Maguire and you have stunt doubles and you can perform certain things that he wants Spider-Man to do. But at a certain point, to create a real Spider-Man, it has to ultimately become a CG character. And so it all became about the transition from the human playing the part to the CG character taking over as perhaps he flies away or is crawling up the side of a building or whatever it may be. Because there's only so much you can physically do because of you know, gravity, basically. I mean, we laid buildings on their side on sound stages and turned cameras over so that it would look like it's vertical and had, you know, Spider-Man crawling up the side. But at a certain point, it's not Spidey enough, is how Sam used to phrase it. Just not Spidey enough. And so that developed these CG characters that took it into this, you know, superhero realm of being supernatural. Polar Express was where we had to change from rolling to commence digital capture. You know, it was the changing of the guard when it came to another way to make a movie. So it became putting actors in a room that was surrounded by infrared cameras and putting tracking markers. At that point, you could have tracking markers over their faces, and they had to wear these funny little spandex suits and all that. But they were able to perform the scenes together and rehearse together in this room. So it was, in essence, like staging a play that you could make cinematic. And the way you did that was you could create your shots after all that footage was shot. So you get your favorite take, you get a couple that you love, you can move on because you can create all the shots later. And that was what Bob wanted. He wanted that control. He wanted the ability to work with actors, you know, all day long so they could perfect the scene. It's not something you get to do when you're shooting a movie. You don't have that much time to rehearse. So we would shoot, and they would eventually, about 2 weeks later, come up with a low-res kind of character version of what they were going to be in the film. And then we hooked up a gear head, actually one that's used for a lever head. We hooked it up to the computer so that we could physically operate the camera. So I could look at a computer screen and I could say, okay, listen, let's start the shot back here at 6 feet. And I want to descend to 2 feet, 11 inches, and I want to get to point B in 3.5 seconds. And so the computer could do that. It would just make that move. And then you could operate it as you're looking at the computer screen, just like you were operating a camera. So you could put a little more human touch into the camera movement and what it was doing. Well, what's interesting about Aquaman is that it's a mixture of the greatest CG effects that have ever been created, and it's old school world of some of the things we did on the set that people have been doing since they started making movies. And that's always what's great about it. It's like you sit in a room and here's the scene, and the actors have to have, you know, this long dialogue scene underwater. Let's just start there. How do you do that? Well, eventually you realize if we're going to make this movie, it's going to be dry for wet. We've got to make it look like they're underwater. Dry for wet is, you know, we weren't the first people to do it, but never to that extensive scale has it been done. And it was a combination of, you know, lots of stunt people and actors getting involved as far as their movement. How do we create that floaty movement? How do we move them around with each other? And so you use some of these old techniques of flying people, modified another step so there's more precise and more exact and more interactable with the actors so that they can rehearse and they can create these scenes and create all the movement that needs to be done. I use some techniques that people have been using forever, which is, it's a water box. You hang them from the stage ceiling and you have water in these big boxes, and you create movement of water in the boxes, and you put hard lights down through them, and it creates all of the flicker that looks like you're underwater. So now you can create this idea on the set pieces of this movement of water. You get a sense of where you are. So you might have a little particulate in the air, a little smoke, a little of this. You can see shafts of light. So you can manipulate the light on the set piece. So you're trying to create this world and you're trying to get everybody on the same page. It takes a lot of time to kind of research and develop these ideas to get them to the point where you're making the movie. And it's always terrifying because you think you got plenty of time to do this, but at the end of the day, on day one, you start shooting the movie, you're still going, oh boy, I hope this works. My favorite CG has always been the movie Contact, where it was the beginning of those two worlds mingling together, opticals and CG, and combining those two worlds. And they were used in a lot of shots that nobody knows that that's what it was, because they're reality-based scenes. It's not about the machine, it's not about the other worlds that were created, which were phenomenal in their own right, but it's all those shots that we sit there and kind of grin because nobody knows. They look so real that nobody knows that they're not, and you've pulled it off. I love that CG. I love that illusion that you can't tell where the real world ends and the CG world begins.